Today is July the 13th. Today we'll look in the book of Psalms and Proverbs at the God of justice, the God of the downtrodden, and the God of mercy. Today, as we read through the Bible in a year, I'd like you to read Psalms 76 and 77 and Proverbs chapter 19. In the book of Psalms, we're in book 3, we continue to read Psalms of Asaph. What we find here is Asaph writes a song, and essentially he is describing in both of these Psalms who God is, the nature of God. He says that God is honored, God is praised, he's glorious, but listen to how he describes God's actions. Psalm 76, verse 9, you stand up to judge those who do evil. The first thing is that God is a God of justice. But in that very same verse, he says, you also stand up to rescue the oppressed of the earth. God has special favor on the downtrodden. Now, throughout 76, we see that. When we begin 77, the psalmist says, I cried out to God. I was in deep trouble. I was depressed. I cried to God, and he didn't answer. Now, there's something with the associating these two psalms together. I really wonder if we're not meant to question, so what has the king done? Has the king been unjust? I honestly believe that Asaph is struggling with that. Verse 4, you don't let me sleep. I'm too distressed even to pray. He says, I think about the good old days when things were good. Then in verse 7 he says, has the Lord rejected me forever? Will he never again be kind to me? In verses 8 and 9, he says, is his unfailing love gone forever? Have his promises permanently failed? Has God forgotten to be gracious? Has he slammed the door on his compassion? The psalmist answers that in verse 11. Then I recall all that you've done, O Lord. I remember your wonderful deeds of long ago. And he goes back to remember that God, although he is a God that judges the unjust, he is also a God who favors the vulnerable. And finally, he is a God of mercy. He's a God who brings us back to him. So let's go to the book of Proverbs. In Proverbs, Solomon continues on this very same thought. Look at what he says in verse 3. People ruin their lives by their own foolishness. Then they're angry at God. Then they're angry at the Lord. Solomon recognizes that people can break God's word. And when they do, many times they get angry at God. They get confused because they think God has rejected them. God is simply living out what he said he would do. Solomon in verse 16 says, keep the commandments and keep your life. Despising them leads to death. Our God is a God of justice. He's a God who favors the oppressed and the vulnerable. And he is a God of mercy. We keep his commands and we're safe. Let's make sure today that we're keeping his commands. Like, follow, and subscribe to this devotional on whatever platform you use to listen to it. Tomorrow, we'll look at some attacks to the early church from unexpected sources and some support from unexpected sources.